planet's puppet masters almost surely have a plan. There's clearly maybe something there beyond the realm of man. And until you've thoroughly tested every last close-chested view, fathom all you think you know, the less you really do. Where would we be without THC? 'Cause we know they're lying to us, just don't know to what degree. Yeah, where would we be without THC? The higher side chats show Greg Carwood and Company.
The power of Christ compels you, people. From the Sunshine State, I'm Greg Carlwood, and if you dig into most cultures and civilizations of the past, you'll find that they have legends, stories, and rich mythologies that acknowledge beings from somewhere else occasionally interacting with us. From well-known fairy folklore and fairly fleshed-out pantheons of gods to shamans who keep their tribes safe from the spirits beyond the campfire's edge, and college kids just trying to have a little fun on the weekends. There are many ways to realize reality is weirder than advertised in today's world, and exotic life forms are just beyond the baseline wavelength. Ask around and most people will know someone who grew up in a so-called haunted house, played with the wrong Ouija board, or has that burned-in memory of waking up with something else in the room. But the longer we wrestle with the question of their existence, the longer it takes to get to the deeper questions of what they actually want. And when the typical testimony includes words and phrases like sexual fluid extraction, hybrid babies, energy harvesting, astral births, moonchild rituals, soul-sucking devices, demon sex, and dream rape, seems like we're dealing with some sort of dark, multidimensional predator on a mission to crack and compromise the components of life and the magic of creation itself. And wouldn't you know it, today's guest Nathaniel J. Gillis has made a name for himself talking about these very things, and the many years of research has brought him to circle around very similar conclusions. For the uninitiated, Nathaniel is an author, lecturer, and religious demonologist, and after being in the deliverance ministry for 15 years, Nathaniel felt called to bring his gifts and research to a more secular venue. For years, he has sought to redefine the nature of hauntings, ghosts, aliens, demons, and other experiences of high strangeness, and I salute him for it. So let's get the party started. The common coast-to-coast commentator, demonology demystifier, and dark entity agenda investigator, Nathaniel, welcome to the higher side.
Man, it's a pleasure to be with you. I am such a fan of the show, and you threw out a lot of titles there, my friend. I hope I live up to whatever we're going to talk about, but you hit the nail on the head. I do believe it's interdimensional of some sort, and I know we're going to get into those case studies, but hello, higher side. Hello, Greg, and I'm just thankful to be with you guys today.
Yeah, man, thanks for taking the time. This is going to be a wild one. I'm excited for it because you do have some perspectives on these beings and their goals that are pretty unique. And I know you've told the story many times, but I understand that you grew up in a haunted house and had experiences that really fueled this lifelong investigation into what it was you saw or experienced. Is that right?
Absolutely. That was my very first encounter with the phenomenon. I was 8 years old. My parents moved into a new house. Before we moved in, even the open house itself was full of manifestation. I witnessed a full-bodied apparition in what would become my future room. And that was my very first encounter with whatever we're dealing with. And once we moved in, the entity evolved in its pathology and it became a shadow figure. It manifested in various ways, but it was instrumental in getting me into this research and into this field. And since then, what I've been trying to do is trying to put these pieces together in a way that's meaningful and germane to others who are also pursuing this mystery.
Yes, fair enough. And I find it really interesting that the way it usually goes is that when a person is curious about these things, they pretty much just put them in the box that their worldview allows for. Like if you're a materialist who thinks spirits are silly, then they must be visitors from another physical planet. If you're a Christian, then they're clearly demons. If you're Irish, then they're fairies, and so on. And even though you're a demonologist, I often hear you using terms like race or predator or other terms that kind of get beyond the categorization that this sort of research often gets caught up in.
Absolutely. I think that is detrimental. It's paramount in doing this research. And I'll tell you what happened to me that kind of got me out of that mode of thinking. Whatever I was experiencing at my house, my local church body was unable to give answers for. That's when I realized that even just Pentecostalism, or it doesn't really matter what denomination, many of them are much alike in the sense that if you experience something that doesn't fit in their blueprint, you're gaslighted, you're crazy, and never happened, you're lying. And, what I realized very quickly was that I had two choices. Either I can stay in the dogma and abandon the data, or I can grow into the data and grow out of the dogma. I can't hold on to both. And in doing that, absolutely, the research led me to believe, not just that I came up with it myself, it was the evidence that led me to believe that we have compartmentalized the phenomenon by virtue of our religious traditions. And in doing so, we've kind of missed the larger behavioral patterns the phenomenon manifests upon its victims.
Yes, behavioral patterns. That's exactly like what I wanted to talk to you about, because it is kind of the thing that leads us to the uniqueness of your perspective. What behavioral patterns do you see in the cases that you look at? What are the commonalities that maybe overlap things we would consider to be spirits with things that we'd consider to be alien? I mean, there's a lot more overlap than people might realize, and that's where the clues are as to what these things even are and what they want, right?
100% correct, sir. 100% correct. I'll tell you this much. The behavioral patterns, plural, that I discovered, they're a lot like bloody footprints in the snow. And then it doesn't really matter what alias the serial killer is using. If it's employing the same ritual technique, if it's employing the same belief systems, the same patterns, it's incumbent upon us to look at this and say, okay, no matter what face we try to place on the phenomenon, what is this really? And to answer your question specifically, the sexual pathology regarding these beings, it's been the same throughout millennia. It has not changed. Much of their victimology is the same. The rituals that they're performing are virtually the same. And so that's why I figured, man, there's something really wrong here. This doesn't seem to be horns and hooves, right? This doesn't seem to be and forgive this term, it's not a derogatory term in any sense of the word, but it's not a Catholic demon, right? It's transcending that microcosm. Whatever it is, it has its own belief system, its own language preference, its own values, and potentially its own currency. And one of the highlights of my research that I'm trying to bring back around is their sexual pathology and their ability and desire to self-replicate by virtue of the missing fetus syndrome. That's one of the biggest key markers that has connected this phenomenon.
Yeah, well, of course, we got to dig deeper into that. Self-replicating from the ghost fetus phenomenon. I've heard you say phantom, missing fetus. What's going on here?
Well, if we go back into history somewhere, we can't really pinpoint when the first encounter occurred, but a woman was visited by an entity that appeared to her in the image of her husband. Now, we first get this obviously in Genesis 6 in the Holy Bible, but we also get in the Apocrypha of John, which is a Coptic manuscript preserved by Egyptian monks. And as far back as the late Iron Age, these people were witnessing the same phenomenon we're encountering today. Nothing has changed, but what we've allowed ourselves to do is fall into the trap of thinking that this is a new phenomenon. And I think here's the reason why I believe is because if we can say it's a new phenomenon, then there's a new origin. It's a recent origin. And that's real easy up until you realize that, okay, if it's an ancient phenomenon, then it originated in antiquity. And so one of the highlights of their pathologies is to use masks of deception to manipulate us into doing whatever they want us to do. So in antiquity, it was the fact that, okay, you have a woman, she's in bed at night, and then an entity manifests to her. She thinks it's her husband. And then they copulate. She's inseminated with the fetus. I don't know how deep you want me to go. There's something
as deep as we can. As deep as we can. Nothing's off limits.
Sweet. Yeah, I couldn't talk about this in other shows sometimes, but
I know. This ain't terrestrial radio, okay?
I appreciate it, brother. I appreciate it. So yeah, essentially the entity would manipulate the victim into, and I say this loosely because it's really not consent. We don't really know what's going on, but there seems to be this game played by the phenomenon to where it doesn't have total access to the female. Because if it did, right, it wouldn't have to play into a role. It would just do whatever it wants to do, go on about its business. But there is this role-playing aspect that my colleagues and I are looking at very carefully, because it's almost measuring belief, to where I'm going to play this role for you. Do you believe I am who I am appearing to be? And then at that point of belief, now that entity steps fully into the role. And now it's almost like a covenant of consent, which I hate that word, but again, we're lacking vocabulary at this point. But this sexual pathology is very rarely evolved throughout history. Like today, they're still appearing to women in the images of former lovers, the images of deceased husbands. And to the point now in my research that I no longer believe that these are entities in and of themselves. I believe that these are not people. These are programs being employed by the phenomenon in order to garner our consent to do whatever they want to do with us. And so the EQBI, the debug phenomenon, we're going to cover those too. Again, I would stress we're dealing with programs, not just people.
Yeah, that is interesting. And I was going to bring up Whitley Strieber just because I think he is a great example of blurring this line, because he got famous for interactions with the entities and the whole anal probe thing, and he got made fun of for that. And when he talked about it being of a sexual nature, people laughed, but he was always pretty clear that these visitors come to him and they take sexual fluids.
100%.
And now, in his later years, and after the passing of his wife, he very much is of the opinion, I believe he got it from her, that these entities have something to do with what we call death.
Oh, yeah.
So, again, it's like, here's that line of messing with the soul or consciousness versus the sexual fluids. These are kind of the same things. These are both mechanisms of life. The sperm hits the egg, and then consciousness infuses with that, and then you have a spirit and a vessel. So you could see some being trying to unpack this, some being that's mystified or curious or envious of human creation. And so they're coming over here and they're like, well, one approach is that we can try to take the sperm and the eggs. Another approach is we can try to extract the soul from the body. And I think it makes sense that you don't have to say either or. These are mechanisms that both get to the same kind of thing if they're curious about it. Or I don't even really understand or know how much they are just mystified by it, or like how much they really know and are really able to use these tools, these fluids, these mechanisms to actually affect life. What do you think?
Well, I think that in order for us to comprehend or even approach who, what, when, and where they are, you have to think outside of the box and outside of the intellectual coffin. Seeing that they've worn masks, there's very few things that we can point fingers at and say, okay, this is what we know for sure. One thing we do know for sure is that they have a preternatural knowledge about our existence. I wish it was as easy. I mean, I used to think that, okay, Dr. Clark Turner would often say that they would extract our consciousness and then manipulate it and then place it back into our bodies. Mm-hmm. But now what we're looking at is their pull of information. From where are they getting access to us? Not just the physical level, but the soulish dimension, where they have actually simulated near-death experiences. Simulated them. That freaks me out.
Yeah,
there are certain things that freak me out. I mean, even me, when I get to the darker parts of the field, it's like, hands off. And that's what disturbs me, the access they have to us. Dr. Barry Fitzgerald was talking one day, and he mentioned something that I think is incredible. He says, when we're doing EVP work, there are a lot of cases where before we could even ask the question, the EVP answers. And his question is something that I echo because he's one of my favorite researchers in the world. How do they have that access? Right? I mean, if we're looking at what they know, they shouldn't know. They should not know when people are going to die.
Yeah.
Right? They just shouldn't. It feels weird. They shouldn't know what kind of clothes people have died in. Let me put it to you this way. Like in the Las Vegas shooting, there was a woman that was shot in the head she was with her family running away from the shots. She's shot in the head and she vividly remembers being peeled out of her body and hovering over her body. Well, these beings seemingly have the same capabilities where they can pluck the soul out of the body and trigger what's called bilocation in their victims, where these people are witnessed in two places at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that their power source is disturbing. And more than that, the way they're using their information against us. It's not just that they know, but they're incorporating that into the mask of deception they employ in many cases.
Yeah, I mean, what I was trying to get at before is, I guess my curiosity is, are they still in the research and development phase, or are they deep into this agenda? Because it seems like wherever their origin is, somewhere non-physical, there is a mechanism of time functioning differently. You hear a lot of that with prophecy. People always think it's right around the corner, and then it ends up being not even in their lifetime. And it's like sometimes you get the right information, but the timeline doesn't translate exactly right.
Mm-hmm.
So they've been doing this from our timeline a very, very long time. So you'd think they pretty much have it mapped out, but it also isn't native to them. So I think maybe there's still some curiosities from their side of things, but there's so much talk now about aliens because when people see a craft in the sky, craft to them equals pilot equals humanoid being from some other place. And you mentioned these things might be programs. When we start talking about technology and tools used by something that we're considering a spirit or a demon, that gets really weird. Like you start thinking about manufacturing and
right.
how a ship is getting created. I've heard you talk about implants as well. There's a physical, technological little chip thing that might serve a purpose to them. How do you wrap your head around spirits or demons using technology?
Well, I think that when we read of their history, their historical presence in time, you see that there were beings that I call them beings, but they had the disability of being. And in their disability of being, they employed technology to make up for what they lacked. If we get back into the implants, again, we're talking about technological necromancy here. I think that's major what we're dealing with. I think that is a behavioral pattern that many researchers will discover here in the next decade. It is technological necromancy. Diana Walsh-Suka mentioned it on the Concrete podcast, where some researchers and engineers believe that these are resurrection machines. So as far back as biblical antiquity in the late Iron Age, we see beings who were not just disembodied, but disincarnate, who were out of a body itself. And so what they were trying to do is employ technology and a self-replication program in order to preserve their existence. Now, it's not nuts and bolts or consciousness. A lot of people are already saying that. It's not new to you guys that are going to listen to this and watch this. But it's not either or, it's both and. And more than that, I think we need to learn how to say that, to say it more often, because it's not either alien or demon, it's both and. And I would highly suggest to you and your listeners, who I have all the respect for, that it's possible we're dealing with an intelligence. It's more demonic than a demon. It's more alien than an alien. It's something that has created these masks to facilitate its own existence, and it's hiding behind these masks. But having the disability of being, to be without being, a being. And so we're looking for is a species that uses the womb to self-replicate, not its consciousness. But if we're looking at disembodied consciousness, from which the fallen angel hypothesis originates, demons, unclean spirits, then what we're looking at, again, are beings that are employing technology in order to facilitate their own existence. Now, do I believe that much, if not all, of the incubi phenomenon that they're programs? I think the evidence suggests that once we get beyond the technology they're employing. Does it make sense?
It does. It does. And maybe what we view as technology as something that they can just conjure up because they have a mastery of the physical. Like maybe it's not like there's an assembly line on the other side of the spirit world where they're putting together crafts and having new models derived. And a lot of times these reports, they'll talk about these crafts when they really get into them, seeming more biological in nature than technological anyway. So who knows exactly what that stuff is, but talk to us about a couple of case studies that you think make for good examples of illustrating the goals of these beings and the different ways they try to go about it. Like if you were to dive into a case or two that checks a lot of these boxes that justifies the hypothesis we're talking about, what would you say to people?
Well, I would say that we have to expand our horizons. I often deal with abductionists who, because they only know abduction literature, if I mention a case study that I've had with incubi entities, it sounds like abductions. They kind of overlap, not even realizing what's occurring. It's hilarious. It's like, now it's an incubi case. No, it's not. But when you're looking at overlapping case studies, there's one book I'm going to pull out, and I've tore this book up, man, because I love it. It'll help fit some pieces together for everybody. It's called Eros and Evil. Obviously, you can see how much I've destroyed it. Eros and Evil by R.E.L. Masters. Here's one of his case studies. It's in witch era literature, and he talks about how some of these witches were being taken. I use that intentionally, being taken on demonic flights. What? Well, I thought this is a new phenomenon. Well, sorry. It's new to people who are new researchers, but so these demonic flights included something very unique. The witch, number one, is basically abducted or kidnapped by what she thinks is a demon. The demon, in some cases, replaced her with an apparition or familiar spirit, to where the husband wakes up in the middle of the night to use the restroom. He looks over and there's Sally sleeping, but it's not Sally. Sally is with this entity. And so when Sally, I'm just going to use the name Sally, so forgive me if you know anybody named Sally. But these women, they get to this spot and they believe they're copulating with corpses and demons, like these actually manifest to them. They're performing the act of copulation. And all of a sudden, the frequency fuzzes out. Program stalls. And now these women are realizing that this is not a mountaintop. That's not a corpse. And that's most certainly not a demon. What they were looking at was a theatrical performance in which they were being poked and prodded by metallic objects. Follow UFO abduction. And then even deeper and darker, perhaps, many of these objects were carved by someone or something to measure the shape of a man, if you know what I mean, to the point that the phenomenon literally tailored an entire experience around their belief system and their religious tradition. But at the point of consummation, something occurred in the program to where these weren't actually people, right? It was technology being employed against these women. And it was some sort of simulation theory, or in a way. But that's just one. I mean, if we get into case studies of my own that imply that it's not just technology, but it's a way of deception that they operate on. And I've had case studies where, like, I'll do a show. Before I do a show, they'll hear about it. So you'll have an influx of some of the people that I'm referring to and have case studies like mine. And one individual told me that she was in bed one night and her husband approached her from the left side of the bed, who said she was induced to do a dream state. She was in and out of it, she said. And next thing you know, her and her husband have a physical moment, I should say. And then afterwards, she starts looking at him. And she said, at first it looked exactly like my husband of 25 years. She said, but then when she looked closer, there were certain facial features that did not belong to him. And that's when she realized this isn't him at all. It grinned at her, turned its head to the side, smiled, and then faded into this black smoke, flew out of the bedroom. Now, this is pervasive in the field. This is not limited to incubi encounters or the D-Book phenomenon. But what we're doing is we're reinterpreting an ancient phenomenon in a modern way. And those are some of the case studies that have led me to believe that there's a high measure of technology being employed.
Yes, the Eros and Evil book. I had a quote here that I got from a post you had on Instagram where Ariel Master says, authorities held that the offspring of unions with demons who survived early childhood often possessed such characteristics as hardiness and boldness, pride and wickedness.
And
They are likely to be exceptionally tall. It was also believed that infants seemingly born of demon-human intercourse were not real or authentically human. They were effigies or fantastic and used by the devil to deceive women and make them think they had given birth. This is kind of like your missing fetus syndrome term that you brought up. I mean, it's complex because when you say that people are somewhat replaced, like a husband has been replaced in his bed or has been taken elsewhere, it's like, is their physical body taken? Is it just their consciousness that's taken? And then a demon's consciousness is put in and used the husband's parts to copulate? That's kind of an odd thing to me. And also, like, when it's men versus women, you've said yourself, I believe, that you've had experiences where you woke up from a dreamlike state and felt like something was riding you in a sexual way.
100%.
It's like, okay, well, when we're talking about two sides of the physical veil, does semen get over there? Or is it better for the being to be the male part of the situation, trying to get at the human female? It's complex stuff. There's layers to what all this is. Help us out.
No doubt, no doubt. So the common question within demonology has always been, where are they getting their seed, right? Do they have semen of their own that they're producing, or are they harvesting it, which already we're hitting on UFO abduction? Or are they harvesting it from males and then going and then inseminating women with it? I suggest that it's the latter. We've seen cases like that throughout all of history, even to the point that Montague Summers and Father Sinistro of Amino talked to witnesses who gave their personal testimony of working in graveyards and seeing these apparitional beings reanimating recently deceased men and then harvesting their excretions to the point. I told you it was going to get dark. I hate that it has to be this dark.
Hey, let's get raw.
Sinistro of Amino was a Franciscan priest, and he was collecting biological excretions left by these entities, and they were discolored. Some of them were black, some of them were gray and green. And he and Montague Summers both agreed independently of each other that some of the very first men who were taken by whatever these beings are were recently deceased, and that they were milking the carcasses of the dead to the point that it influenced our funerary rites, right? We have to bury them as soon as possible. Why? They believed that they were what we would consider to be vampires, right? Who would go in and biologically just extract things from that person. And so at first blush, it is necromancy. In a sense, it's necrophilia. It's kind of it's all there. But what's interesting to me, though, is, okay, if it is their seed, or if it is our seed, then why is it that even when we're mingling with the devil, that the offspring, they're tall, like really tall? That was a high note for me, because when we're looking at hybridization and antiquity, we see the Genesis 6 narrative, and we see their offspring as giants. So if it is just our seed, then I believe they are obviously having to genetically modify it to create the biological avatar that they wish to possess.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you mentioned them self-replicating, and if they're taking our seed and using human wombs, then where is the hybrid? You know, for the nature of hybrid suggests that one half of this is coming from somewhere else. Sometimes I think it might just be like the consciousness. I mean, if a demon possesses a man who then has sex with a woman, is that offspring different? Is it not necessarily the man whose consciousness was kicked out of the body for a little while?
Right.
Is there a connection between the sexual fluids and the womb and the consciousness of the human who's in it.
100%, 100%. So in the Apocrypha of John, it talks about these beings that manifested to women in the image of the husband, and they took upon that appearance. And then at the moment of conception, they stared into the eyes of the victim, inseminated with the seed, and then changed its apparition to what it really looked like. Now, this is an abstracted tradition in Mesopotamian literature. They believed at that time that whatever image the woman was looking on at the moment of conception, she will birth the material image of that man through her womb as a child. Now, what's so interesting about this specific pathology is that the beings did not want to make a child that looked like the husband they're impersonating. No, they wanted to make literally a biological avatar of whatever they themselves look like. Now, this gets back into the idea of a hybrid. The idea of a hybrid is almost calcified within the tradition of just being mixing DNA and stuff. I think you're on the right track because I'm of the same thought process that it was their seed, but the image of this entity and the consciousness of the entity that was in the fetus. Now, let me give you some very interesting case studies throughout history. Now, in the Debut phenomenon in the 16th century, what we call them Divics, but essentially there was a movement in Safdi, Israel. It's a province in Israel where this group of people were trying to contact the deceased. And in doing so, they created their own rituals, they created their own traditions, and they had what's called the doctrine of Gillis, which they operated off of. But here's what's really striking to me. They operated off of the belief that our intentions with them determine their intentions with us. Well, it's when I read that, I thought, see? And then suddenly what started happening was women were going to bed at night, even men were going to bed at night, and beings were manifesting to them in their dreams. Some men were quoted as saying, okay, since that dream, I met a being that I'm being told is my son. This is an incubi, succubi literature. And then the young man will say things like, I'm a virgin. Where did this thing come from, right? Even deeper and darker, perhaps, women were being accosted by entities in these dream states. When they woke up the next day, they shrug it off, whatever. It was a bad dream, no big deal. They go to work and they look down and they have ligature marks on their wrists and ankles. They have scarifications, skin anomalies that are manifesting on their bodies that directly correlate with the nightmare they thought they had. What we're dealing with, again, is they induce people into dream states. They hack our belief systems. They do what they want. But even more than that, these women started to become possessed by the entity that had assaulted them. So this is the point in my lecture where I tell people that possession to us is pregnancy to them. It's being pregnant with consciousness. That's the game they play. And so these women became possessed by the entity that assaulted them, and then they present themselves to the exorcist. The exorcist's job is to interrogate the entity. Who are you? What are you doing here? Why did you choose this victim? And on and on. Well, one day, these beings, their pathology evolved from just merely possessing women. Now it merged into the incubi house and also into the missing fetus syndrome. Because now these women were showing up to church or showing up to the temple, synagogue, and now they have a fetus in their womb. And at first blush, these demonologists, they called all the physicians together and said, first of all, what is going on here? She's definitely possessed, but there's a fetus in her. And so they performed what's called the lavouche. See, this is very dark stuff that very few people are talking about. But they performed the lavouche, and the lavouche method was to press the thumb on the wrists of the woman. And in doing so, they felt two heartbeats in one body, two pulses in the same body. And so their hypothesis is still startling to this day. They asked the question, is this woman possessed by the entity or pregnant with it? And being pregnant with it, what they did is they performed an exorcism. Now, wouldn't you know, when the phenomenon retracted the consciousness, they also took the fetus itself. And so my hypothesis at this current time is that we've been focusing so much on the fetal presence instead of the consciousness that they're placing inside of it. And that leads me to believe that that is the true hybrid, not just the DNA aspect, but the fact that they will take babies and they'll place their own consciousness in it as a self-replication method.
Damn, I mean, very interesting. I use that term dream rape in the intro because it does seem like, I don't know if the dream world is exactly the spirit world or if that's a separate dimension, but they seem to be able to commune with us on this plane, and things that actually occur there can affect us physically. I mean, we've all seen scenes in movies where The Mask is a good example, where he thinks he's making out with Cameron Diaz and then she's licking the side of his face and he wakes up and it's a dog licking the side of his face. It's his dog. So also we've probably had the phenomenon of our alarm going off and it goes off in the dream. And then we slowly realize, oh, this is a dream. I'm sleeping and my alarm's going off and I got to get ready for work. So sounds and things touching us in the physical while we're asleep can project themselves kind of onto that dream state. And so there's a mechanism there even without entities. So if you fold entities in, they can probably play with those mechanisms and manipulate us even more than we otherwise would be.
100%. And that's a great point that you bring up. Now, for those who haven't heard my story, mind if I go and tell it about, that entity that manifested to me?
Tell it.
Very strange. Because at the time, I wasn't even in the field. Like, I wasn't doing lectures or podcasts or anything. I was doing hard research, like deep stuff. So one night I get off of work. At the time I was working in a factory. I get off work. I was working second shift. Friday night, you know how it is, man. You just probably want to grab a beer or something, take a hot shower, watch SportsCenter or something. I don't know.
Amen.
Yeah. And so I'm there in bed and my fiance is already asleep. It's Friday night. I go to bed and I'm immediately in this dream. And I mean, I hit hard, just instantly already. And I knew that it wasn't just a usual dream. There was something, I don't say prophetic. I think there was something profound about it. It felt different. And in this dream, there is this female shadow figure. It's features. The hair is going down. And it looked identical to my fiance. Like if you took her, put her in a dark room, turn the light off, and your eyes adjust, you don't see facial features, but you see the outline. So I thought it was my ex. And this entity had straddled her. And so in the dream, I'm trying to get her off of me, like trying to push her off. And while I'm doing this, I wake myself up. And to my astonishment, the entity was not just in my dream. The entity was literally on top of me. Yet I'm hitting my ex, not hard, not abusively, mind you, but I'm like, oh my God, like, I won't mention her name, but I'm asking her, like, is that you? Where are you? Is that you? Because my eyes are still adjusting. And finally, she wakes up, looks up, and says, what is that? And when that happened, this entity took one leg, pulled it over, and just disappeared in the darkness. So in antiquity, we would call these beings dream demons. But that was our attempt to place that face on the phenomenon. But in dream demons and dream demonology, these beings would descend down, especially at nighttime, induce their victims into dream states. And here's a key component. They would stare into the eyes of their victim. Now, I'm not the only one speaking about that. Obviously, Bud Hopkins, Dr. Kohler Turner, David Jacobs, other abductionists have encountered that phenomenon. But I would like to suggest something that would give us more clarity and context to what's occurring. Behind our eyes, there is the frontal, media, orbital cortex. That is the part of our brain that tells us whether or not what we're experiencing is real. So it's not just the hypothesis of David Jacobs, which I love. It's not just that they're looking into our eyes to gain some eye contact. No, I believe, again, they're hacking our own brain. It's like when we go to movies and we've got surround sound, the chair we're sitting in is vibrating. It's that part of our brain that determines whether or not what we're looking at is actually occurring to us. So this has been occurring for millennia, but I think, again, that what we're doing right now is we're applying a modern interpretation to something that's been around forever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. And speaking of that modern interpretation, obviously we have congressional hearings and the David Grush stuff and all these military men telling us about their experiences. And it is all framed in this very militaristic complex. I'm sure the industrial complex is going to get a nice fat check soon here to deal with all this.
Oh, yeah.
But we do know from Nick Redfern's book, Final Events, which I know you've talked about before, there was a contingency, probably still is, within the government, the big machine, that concludes very differently and is more on the page that you're on, which is that this is an ancient thing and a spiritual religious context is a lot more accurate than a sci-fi one. I actually saw a post from Nick recently where he said he wanted to write the sequel to Final Events, but the typical publishers he has relationships with have said no. So that's interesting because it's his most popular book, I would say.
Nope.
He would make a lot of money, but for some reason, the publishers don't want to milk that cow. And he said he's going to do it on his own. So I'm interested in exactly what he has to add to the stack there.
Isn't it?
But we can say that at least a portion of the government knows that it's a red herring to put this in a sci-fi type of context. And the Collins elite were very interested in pursuing things a different way. For those who aren't familiar, maybe talk to us a little bit about the Collins elite and how far that went and just your thoughts on their general approach.
So check this out. So there was a group within the Department of Defense that were deeply religious, very educated. And many of them were engineers, physicists. And so what they were trying to do is to look at the demonological connections with UFO abductions and ufology. And so they would travel around. It was very interesting to me when I read this book because I'm thinking, okay, what is their approach, right? How do they even investigate? I was very interested in that. How would a physicist that's religious even, how would they interview a person with the likes of Sybil Leek? It made no sense to me. But what they were doing is they were looking at out-of-body experiences and the possibility that what we're dealing with is a mechanism that steals souls. That was their reigning, I don't know if it still is, we have to look at his upcoming book. That was their reigning hypothesis, was that these beings not only simulate near-death experiences, but these beings have actually orchestrated murders, orchestrated killings. And I won't use the S word, but even that, to take things from people and to take them from their own selves. And so their interests, they went to different religious scholars, different demonologists, different spiritualists. My main focus on their research consisted of Sybil Leek. Now, for those who aren't familiar with her, she considered herself to be a white witch. And she was a contemporary to Aleister Crowley. And so many times when she lived in the UK, Crowley would show up at her cottage, light candles, perform rituals, and talk to her about his research. Well, at one point in her life, she moved to Los Angeles, which gave the Collins elite more access to her. She's just right around the corner. We don't have to go across the pond. So sure enough, one day, these physicists from the Department of Defense knock on her door. Hey, Sybil, got some free time? Sure. They go into her kitchen. They sit down at her dinner table and they start asking her questions. What do you think these beings are that Aleister Crowley contacted? Where are they coming from? And is there a possibility that you yourself can contact them as a channeler? I'll try. And so sure it was. She goes into her trance work and the entity manifested through her. But when it did, it wasn't normal. It was, what is this? What is this? And so the entity manifests through her and it begins to address the people in the room. They ask the age-old question, are you an extraterrestrial? The entity began to scoff at them and mock them verbally, laughed at them, told them that of course we're not extraterrestrial. That's just our newest deception.
Okay.
Masks. But their work also, I mean, I don't know how much I want to get into this, but they were working with a guy named, I think his name was Paul Garrett.
Mm-hmm.
And Paul Garrett, had an out-of-body experience, near-death experience, I believe, and he witnessed these silver metallic objects hovering over people and then doing something to these individuals to where a ball of light would leave their body and it would go up into this UAP. That's not abnormal. Even in abduction accounts, Betty Luca witnessed one of these entities. Literally, it was almost like a morgue. There are bodies everywhere. And they would take their hand and hover it, move it over the bodies, and then consciousness or orbs, not specks of dust, even though some of those orbs are, but an actual ball of light would ascend out of their bodies and into whatever we're dealing with. But that was their sole pursuit, was trying to link these beings to ancient demons. Now, my theory and hypothesis is a little bit different than theirs. Their belief is that these are horns and hooves. These are demons. Like, they are demons. They're not just masking themselves as demons. They are, in fact, demons. My hypothesis is rooted in the idea that we're dealing with a singular intelligence that has used demonology as a mask, just as it's using the ET hypothesis as one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's wise to conclude that. You could throw in fairies as another lens that it is used to let us believe that's what it is, when really its true nature is hidden. And we can come back to that thing of like what their core goal is. Do you think it's focused on consciousness, or you say self-replicating? Is that really their main function? You would say humanity's main function is to procreate and replicate.
Right.
Is that their primary goal, or do they want to do something more to humanity? Are they trying to make hybrids, or are they just trying to continue their own kind?
Well, when we get into these abduction accounts, even in antiquity, there's something that we see, it's glaringly obvious. There is a control mechanism being employed by the phenomenon. If you get too close, it will correct you. If you see too much beyond the veil, it will self-correct. It will evolve in order to evade. It evolves. Now, again, this speaks of it, not a program, something that is hyper-intelligent, hyper-evasive. Even more than that, when we get into accounts of them producing string memories, we saw that in the 16th century with some of these possession accounts where the victims didn't quite know what to remember. Was that real, or is this real? Was I really assaulted, or was this just a figment of my imagination? Going deeper here, when we're looking at what they're wanting us to remember, we have to pay attention to what they're wanting us to forget.
Mm-hmm.
And the truth is, at this point, it's like Dr. Coley Turner said, that there are very few behavioral patterns that we know for sure. Everything else is murky. I mentioned this last night on Coast. Dr. Coley Turner had an experiencer who was out at a picnic, I believe, and she witnessed this UFO, UAP, hovering over a house across the street. In her mind, she vividly remembered taking binoculars, giving it to her friends. Check it out. Look. Going into the house, unboxing her new telescope, mounting it on the deck, showing her friends. And she said, here's the problem. I don't even own binoculars. She said, I woke up the next day and I had to call my friend because I'm like, okay, didn't you remember? She went, they're looking at through a telescope. Well, yeah. Well, my telescope hasn't left the box it came in. It's still in plastic. So these are the things they're wanting us to remember. I'm after what they're wanting us to forget, because I believe those aspects of the phenomenon are the very keys that unlock the door, not just to them, but to us and to our own potential as a species.
Yeah, I mean, that's super fascinating. It makes me think about some psychologists out there that are taking a different approach to mental health and looking at entity attachments. And when it gets into memory, it seems like people are able to have multiple entity attachments and they forget that when they were younger, they might have made a deal like, hey, if I can get this girl to like me, I will do what you want, or just something
Right.
like these little things that kids say, they do matter. Like, it sounds like people are coming to the conclusion that these are real agreements. If you put it out there in the universe, an entity will step forward and say, I got you, buddy.
Oh,
And
yeah.
years later, it might still be embedded in your subconscious somewhere. So I think that's got to be coming into play. It seems that people can unknowingly, unconsciously have multiple entities attached to them. I don't know if they're feeding. I don't know if they're like barnacles on a whale exactly, like what the entity gets out of that. But that's a mechanism too, like of getting inside of someone's being and living there without their knowledge for years.
Yeah, absolutely. It's both symbiotic and embryotic, if you will. It wants to live inside and to possess. So, have you ever heard of the Moffat case? Deborah Moffat.
Doesn't sound familiar right off the bat.
So check this out. This deals with the occult, but the Moffat family owned 3 different houses in a cul-de-sac, and they rented out 2 of them.
That's nice.
Yeah, it's a pretty cool setup, but they all live in one house. Well, they had a housekeeper who would come in and clean all the rentals, including their house. And this particular individual, she performed the Santeria ritual, and she botched it. So I don't want people saying, okay, I hate Santeria. What I'm saying is she botched it. And she messed up. Maybe it was the utterance, the incantation, the verbiage. I don't know. The diction. I don't know. She didn't either, but she said that in the middle of it, she said something went wrong. And when she did, there was this ball of light that appeared in the room, and it chased her out of the house. And so she went to the family, was apologizing. She said, okay, I heard that the mother was sick and I was just trying to perform a ritual to heal her. Now, this gets into something that I'm going to ask us to entertain, right? Not saying we have to completely commit belief here, but let's entertain this.
Sure.
Deborah Moffat then says, a week later, she wakes up in the morning, gets ready for work, goes to the bathroom, looks at the mirror, and something had taken soap and written on the mirror. Talk to me is what it said. Talk to me. Wipes it off, goes to work. She's like, I'm not talking to what the... Anyway, so she comes back. Again, the entity wrote on the mirror again. Talk to me. Talk to me. So she has all of this, and this is all documented. She has photography. I think she met with Emma Rain Warren and other researchers about it. But anyways, come to find out, this entity had used that mortal portal. And this is what it said to her. Hundreds of years ago, your mother's soul was promised to me by virtue of sacrifice. And now I want you to perform the sacrifice. And so it gives her a written note, how to perform the blood ritual, what to use, when to perform it, and it goes on and on. Now, I'm going to get into some of the documentation because it's hard to believe. But if we're getting into the idea that at least some of these beings are knowledgeable about incantations, and they actually respond to them, then what are we really dealing with here? Even in biblical antiquity, with the teraphim, which is the modern day implant, they would carve incantations and names of spirits into metal and implant it into either heads, they're called talking heads, or actual living people. And the consciousness that merged with the matter, memory within the matter, stepped into that body and began to operate it like it's its own. But there is this technological necromancy present. There is this knowledge of esotericism here that on their part that I don't think we can ignore. What kind of an extraterrestrial would answer incantations from a Brahma in the mage?
Right.
What are we dealing with here? And I have this lecture that I do And then talk about, okay, who's conjuring the conjurer? Are we really conjuring them, or have they conjured us? In asking that question, I tell the story about the shortest story ever told, the shortest horror story. The last man on earth was alone in his house, and there came a knock on the door. Right? It's not us.
I love the term mortal portal. That's a good one. And it kind of gets back to that manufacturing consent sort of thing. It's like, did you decide to pick up this grimoire because you thought it was interesting, or did this being make this book catch your attention, and thus you open it up, you flip to page 56. Why 56? This being might be playing you like a puppet the whole time, getting you to dial its number.
Yes.
And then it can't respond until that number is dialed, perhaps. I mean, you are well known for saying the reason they're playing by different rules is because they're playing a different game. I'm curious if you could in any way map out the rules of that game. I've heard you talk about the open vessel law. There seems to be some kind of rules to certain demonic interaction. What are the rules to their game?
Oh my God. Well, let me take a step back and go on a micro level here. When I realized that there were rules that we were given and we were told that they play by. If they're devils, they're almost all Catholic, obviously. And so they all have they're all in this one religious tradition. It's not true. They have their own language preference, their own belief systems, and their own memories. They encase their own currency, their own values. They're playing by different rules because they're playing a different game. The game is obviously using deception. Now, do I know what the end result is? I don't. I'll be honest with you. I'm not like one of those people who, have an answer for everything. I wish I did. But when we're getting down to some of the rules that they follow I think it was the 17th century, there was a case study where a woman was accosted by one of these beings. And when the priest interrogated it, he said that we are outlawed. We are forbidden to touch her unless she had been intimate with somebody. And then that opened the door for them to say, okay, now we can go. It doesn't make sense to me. Again, now getting back to the rules that they play by, we have to understand something. This is a key component in the phenomenon. Much of what we're dealing with is propaganda by them. Much of what we're dealing with, even the rules that they told us they don't follow.
Sure.
Now, here's what disturbs me with the CE5 movement. We've created rules that they must follow. If they're not going to follow their rules, what makes us think they're going to follow ours?
Right.
Nonsense. Forgive me for saying that. Absolute nonsense. Here's why. Okay, draw a circle. I'll stay inside the circle. Yeah, until they beat the crap out of somebody.
Sure.
Right? At a certain point, we've got to realize that this onion is layered. And truthfully, by the time we peeled it enough to realize, okay, this is where they are, that's where they were. They have changed and they've evolved in order to evade us. But yeah, it makes no sense. I mean, if they're not playing by their rules, they literally gave us these rules and said, hey, we'll follow them. And they don't.
Right.
It's troubling.
It is troubling. I think some people have the idea that the rules are set by God. And so they're immutable and unbreakable. And you have to invite the demon in for it to be able to even mess with you at all. There's a bit of comfort in that. But then, of course, sometimes the demons, they show up in the most innocent form, like a kid at the door. And then you let them in. Yeah. And now you're completely fucked. So they have ways of skirting the rules. We mentioned consent at the beginning, and like consent's a little bit of a fuzzy thing because you can manipulate that consent. If anyone knows about Neil Strauss's book, The Game, which is just about lame guys figuring out the code to look cool to women, and
correct,
through repetition and going over it again and again, they developed a system for betting women. So did those women consent? Sure, they did, but they were manipulated by someone being disingenuous.
Correct.
And you could say spirits operate the same way. They even if they need to get consent, even if that's a rule of the game, they get it in these roundabout, disingenuous ways, it seems.
Right. And for those who are going to listen, forgive me for even using the word consent. And I know I'm the one that first brought it up. I think, again, that when we're dealing with the phenomenon, we're still groping for better vocabulary. We really are. You know, George asked me last night, are you a demonologist? What's a demonologist? I don't know. What is a demon?
Right. It gets weird.
If I can't determine what a demon is, how can I, the truth is, this is where my research started, and that's how I'm mostly known. So that's what I have to use as a working title. But deception is prevalent. Even Dr. Colin Turner had a case study of Ted Rice. Ted Rice was with his grandmother. These beings abducted both him and his grandmother. And this hybrid entity tried to mate with the grandmother. And she's like, no. She's like, I've only been intimate with one man. Again, you see the behavioral pattern all the way from the late Iron Age, right? Sorry to harp on that. So I've only known one man, and that's my husband, but he's been deceased now for years. Oh, I got something for you. From the shadows emerges her husband. Where are they pulling? So there's only a handful of options here that really make sense. Either they have access to the internet and they could just, or they're literally in real time plucking images and beliefs from our minds.
Yeah, that's most likely to me.
Exactly. Masking themselves in our memories, failing themselves in our belief systems, and potentially them being the orchestrators, the designers of certain belief systems in which they would hide behind that mask. And of course, you're going to let me do what I want to do because I'm an angel, aren't I?
Mm-hmm. Right? It gets very weird. If they can manipulate imagery to appear real, if they can extract things from our own memories and use them against us, it's like, how fluid is reality itself? I mean, is there any concrete reality? Is this all a creation, a terrarium, a container for the mind just to be fed upon whenever this race or this one true entity decides that it wants to? It gets weird. There were some other things related to the rules and mechanisms that I've heard you say in previous interviews that I just thought were interesting, like this observation that some women are no longer haunted after a hysterectomy. So, you have this situation where a person's no longer fertile and the entity's like, all right, we're done. I've been chasing you down whenever I decide for many years at night. And now that you are no longer fertile, I'm just done. I mean, that's interesting. That obviously speaks to its goals. And I've also heard you mention, or at least hypothesize, that birthmarks could be indications of some sort of fuckery there when a kid is born with a strange birthmark. Maybe that has something to do. Maybe that's a clue.
Yeah.
Not that I want people who have kids with birthmarks to think that they were demon raped on the dream plane and their kid is not really their own. Right. But I mean, there might be some signs. There might be some physical signs when this sort of thing happens. If it happens, then, maybe we need to know when that occurs.
Correct. I'll tell you what, this is a case study that really, really disturbed me. And this is one of them where I shut down, canceled my shows for like the month, and I just left. I went to Rhode Island and I feasted on some of the best Italian food in the world.
Good medicine.
But anyways.
Good medicine.
Yeah, definitely, man. Definitely helped me, as you can tell. Nonetheless, my friend, now I'm going to give you a case study it's dark. And I think the reason it's so dark is because of the implications. And I think it points to the fact that we're dealing with interdimensional entities and not just something we can put in a box, throw away the key, put them in the corner, and there will always be ETs, I was doing a lecture one night about symbolism, scarifications that these beings afflict and inflict on their victims. So one of the case studies I was talking about was Father Sinna's story of Amino, Father Sinna's story, if I could say it, on Amino. He was working with these victims, and one of them had passed away. And so he got a letter from the family saying, hey, listen, I would like you to be present we're going to perform an autopsy for my wife, and we're having some other physicians present. We're going to look at some troubling aspects of her encounter. And so in doing so, they had her on the table and they peeled back her eyelids.
As you do.
Yeah, as you do. It's commonplace. Yeah. And underneath her eyelids, and unbeknownst to her and to her husband, there were symbols that these beings had carved in them. Symbolism being the simplification of language. It's the iceberg effect. That's all we see, but that's not all that's there. So it was upon that foundation that I gave a lecture about skin anomalies. And then in doing so, I got an email from an individual who, he said his father was a renowned remote viewer. And he says, my father would get paid by local celebrities, local politicians. He would give readings. He would go into trances, leave his body, meet with his guides. And then he would get back into his body. He'd call up someone, say, hey, you know what? Hey, Joey, you're going to do a good job this year in your college football season, whatever. He said, but one night, he said his father ran down the stairs. He was pale and he couldn't hardly talk. He was out of breath and he had a massive coronary. When they got into the hospital, and I have photographic evidence of this, they took pictures of him and his chest, because when he said that when we were taking his shirt off, put the robe on, underneath the skin, moving to the surface, were 3 religious amulets. Why are ETs using religious amulets? More so, he said that it was subdermal, underneath the skin, moving themselves to the surface of it. The first one was the Jewish Star of David. The second one was the cross. The third one is perhaps the most curious. It was an Egyptian hieroglyphic that arched. Now, this behavioral pattern of being out of body and then skin anomalies manifesting once you're in body, again, is not new. This happened to Betty Luca. This has happened to other experiencers, where we're thinking, oh, these are scoop marks because they scoop the mark, right? They mark scoop. Mm-hmm. We're not realizing that in many cases, these individuals are experiencing this phenomenon only after being re-embodied. And so there's this correlation that I'm still working on, because if you get into Ian Stevenson's work with past life regressions, right, in past lives, people have recorded that, like, okay, if I was shot in the neck or something, or stabbed, or I got into a car wreck, and that the death blow, the death mark, the point where the bullet entered the body, in the new body, it manifests as a birthmark. Mm-hmm. So there is a soul to skin connection here that I think these beings are operating also, even deeper than that. I've had case studies and worked with families, where they were experiencing malevolent haunting. And in this malevolent haunting, the entity would attack them. And so they would feel a burning sensation, not unlike this remote viewer. Burning sensation begins. Where is it burning? Oh, it's burning over here. And then subdermally, from underneath the skin, scratches move themselves to the surface. Whatever we're dealing with is using religious amulets. Not all the time, but it doesn't matter. They're employing them. And the way they're employing them eclipses the microcosm of religious experience and demonology itself.
Right. And, it makes you think about the religious symbols themselves. Did they emerge out of the religion, or did they get incorporated into the religion because they have some kind of real power and value to these beings, or to, in some cases, protect against these beings? I mean, sigils and language do seem like real mechanisms. God spoke the word and all that. And of course, Tesla would talk about frequency. Well, spoken word is frequency. Maybe sigils also have some kind of like multi-dimensional imprint that can open a portal or allow interactions with these beings. So it does get weird. You mentioned that they have preferred languages? I would assume that would be like Latin, Hebrew, Arabic, maybe Egyptian, as you say. Like the ancient languages seem to be way more related than the modern languages. Of course, when it gets to like interactions, a lot of times it's just consciousness to consciousness. So
Right.
they speak in whatever language you know, but we often hear stories of a kind of buzzing, chirping, chattering kind of thing in the mix when they're talking to each other in these experiences. I know you've talked about that before. What do you think that is? I mean, is it as simple as saying just their language or what? Because it's a little strange.
Yeah, it absolutely is, sir. Well, this buzzing frequency, chirping mechanism that they have, I first found that behavioral pattern not in abduction literature, not in witch era literature, but it was in the Bible when it talks about the language of necromancy and how that certain necromancers, when they were possessed by that disembodied spirit would not only have language preference in the sense of, okay, I was an Englishman and I, not just that, but there was a universal language of the deceased that would come through the necromancer themselves. And it was a buzzing, chirping language. Now, this is so fascinating to me because I was working with another researcher in New England, and he had heard this aspect of the field and whatever we're dealing with. He said, I haven't told a story before. He said, but the reason I got into the field is because of what I experienced as a kid. He said, as a kid, I was always troubled with illness. He said, I was always sick, always out of school, and just playing video games at the house, throwing up, whatever. He said, one night I'm sleeping, and he said, I woke up and I'm sick, but at the end of my bed, there was an entity just standing there staring at me. He said, the next thing I know, there's this vibrational pull. And he said, then I am now outside of my body. He said, and then I'm staring back down at it. And I realized that the being that I witnessed in the corner was no longer there. He said, now I'm thinking, okay, where is he? He said, that's when I realized that he's in my body. Now my body is animated, it's moving. But it's moving without me in it. Now, this is something out of a movie. But he said, next thing I know, the entity looks at me. He said, and I'm staring into my own eyes. And from that moment, it began to use my vocal cords to speak. And it was a chirping, buzzing sound. And he said it was the creepiest sound he's ever heard. It was really weird. It freaked him out. But their ability to pull us out of ourselves cannot be underestimated or understated. I tell people all the time that the greatest threat to ever haunt us is the being that can peel us out of ourselves without our permission, and in some cases without our memory.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, that's a fascinating story. And I'm just curious, if they have such mastery over us and the physical world and even our dreams, why does there seem to be some kind of fear in them, or at least some retreat whenever they're discovered? You think they would just be like, yeah, go ahead and watch me dream rape
absolutely.
you. Go ahead and watch this happen. But when they are discovered, they seem to retreat. And I'm just curious why that is. Why isn't this like a Matrix situation where we're all just plugged into our chairs and they have absolute dominance and we have no free will or freedom at all?
Yeah, that presents a conundrum here. Even with the access to knowledge that they possess, that remote viewer, he was famous in his town for giving accurate prophecies. On this day, you're going to meet a person with this name. He's tall, blonde-headed, whatever, wearing a polo or something. And then it happens. And so that's how he got paid. And then all of a sudden, he would be given another prophecy by the same beings that was so wrong. Like, you know what I mean? It's not that it didn't happen. Like, it was so completely wrong that it made them question, okay, if they have access to that knowledge, why lie?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And if they have that much power, why play the role? Unless there is some kind of, where I'm going, my friend, some kind of manufactured consent involved to which they do something and they look back at someone else and say, hey, they believed it, or they believed I was that deceased person. I don't really know, but it's something that I've been working with my colleagues to understand more. If they had total access to us, just go in, get what you want, and leave. You don't have to mask yourself in order to do so. It makes no sense.
Right. Yeah. There must be some reason why they don't just completely dominate us all day, every day, at all times.
No.
It could be something like when you're a predator and you have prey, if you have like a flock of sheep, maybe it's easier just to pick off a few of them and let the herd not descend into chaos because you can kind of manage the herd a little bit. But a lot of predators, they strike when their prey senses their presence rather than fade away and retreat. So there is something weird going on there.
Most definitely.
Maybe it's just one of the rules of the game that we haven't been read in on.
I would love to know, because that makes no sense to me. I mean, when you have one of Dr. Kohler Turner's experiencers who's just taking a nap in the middle of the day, I'm off work, kind of tired, I'll take a nap. And then she wakes up to this mysterious figure hovering over her. It doesn't make sense. And there's something wrong there. I don't think it's designed to make sense, right? It's not. It's not a bug. It's a feature within the program to continuously update itself, to evolve in order to evade. It's a lot like a jellyfish that once it's in a certain environment, where is it?
Right.
Oh, it's playing a role. What do you mean? It's manifesting, but we're often blinded by our own vision.
Mm-hmm. Well said. And along with like them having complete control over these experiences when they happen, it also makes me wonder why they are so rare. If these beings are using us to self-replicate or even create hybrids, you would think that if they've been doing this for the last 500 years, it'd be pretty undeniable. So there is a weird thing going on there. Of course, if they can affect memories, who knows how rare it truly is. Maybe it's only rare to remember.
Very good point.
That's something that should be factored in. But it does seem like these experiences don't happen to everybody.
Right.
So, I mean, what would you say about that? Like, have you ever tried to map out how many of them there are versus how many people there are and how close to the complete end game of their agenda they might be?
Well, I think they are working on a time frame here, a timetable, and even a schedule. I had a case not too far from where I live. It was an incubus encounter where the woman was going to bed at night, and the entity was crawling in bed next to her. And so the husband was a veteran. So he's working 9 to 5. He gets off work and he's frustrated. He challenged it, and he said that one night something balled its fist up and punched him square in the face. And so when I got there on the second visit, he had Bell's palsy. And whatever this being did to him, he had like a lot of facial trauma. So he was talking to me and he said, this thing has been visiting us now for like 2 or 3 years. And he said, what I don't understand is it's only like within the month of October. I'm thinking, wait a minute, what do you mean? You know what I mean? Like, what? Yeah, so it would only come at a certain time of the year and only would stay for like 2 or 3 weeks at a time and then leave. So again, they're following their own time frame, their own timetable. But getting back to your hypothesis that you presented, it is worth our consideration. Dr. Kohler Turner came up with something in her book, Taken, that we are like cattle to them. And this idea that many people have of, okay, if they're a threat, they kill us all. Little extreme. Are we a threat to cattle? Pretty much. We're killing a bunch of them. But watch this. We need them to self-replicate.
Right.
Not us. We need them to keep having more of themselves.
Exactly. Sorry, I was saying earlier, I was like, how close are they to their end game? And then I immediately thought, well, what is the end game? Is the end game to compromise every last human soul and body? Or is it just to have a steady supply for whenever you want to go there? Is it just like grain in the silo?
Right.
Like you just want to have abundance for when you want to pick a fruit off that tree. And we are that fruit, apparently. So it's maybe for some people who are skeptical, they would think that this should occur more often, but you don't really know what their logic is on the other side.
Correct. And we don't know who has yet to tell their story. I could tell you this, I've been on shows with people, both men and women, where they hold to the standard of, okay, we're not dealing with a threat. It's non-threat, not a threat, all the stuff. And then when we get off the show, we're in the green room and we're just talking, hanging out. Hey, I got to bang your ear. I got to tell you something. What is it? Oh, well, what you're talking about, they've been doing to me since I was young. So you see, right? But again, there is a movement, and I have to say it, and I'm saying this with all humility. I don't even know if it's intentional, but there's a movement in the field that poo-poos on negative experiences and negative experiencers. I've worked with people who were supposed to be a part of a documentary or supposed to be a part of a study. And once they sent in their account, it was too negative. We don't want to include that. And what we're realizing, even with our friend, I said it liberally, our friend Nick Redfern, right? There are publishers, even in my field right now, the skin that crawls. Like there are things that I can't even talk about, not just on shows, but where it's like, okay, I'm not going to put that in. Like, what are you talking about? I'm not going to do that. And yet I'm trying to make the research as pure as possible on my end. I'll tell you, okay, I'm going to go in a different direction here. But Dr. Colin Turner was talking about how that she got fed up with what she was experiencing, got tired of being lied to. And she contacted what she had considered to be God or the angelic or something. And she said, so one night after she initially contacted them, she goes to bed, goes to do a dream. And in this dream, she said it was virtually a nightmare. Like it was really, really bad. And then all of a sudden, boom, something plucked her out of the dream, placed her in a chair that was a real chair, not in her house, but it was a real chair. And she was in front of, it looked like a panel, if you will, of beings. And she said the chair was real. She said, I felt it with my hands. It was physical. She said, but they asked me, they said, okay, you did contact us, right? Yeah, I did. Okay, fine. You want to know the truth? Sure. And she said for like 45 minutes, they played her a looping video of Jacob deceiving his father, taking the birthright. So this is fascinating. At the very end, they told her that this is what's happening to your planet and to your species. Earth belongs to you and you belong to yourself. But there is another who's playing a role and he wants everything you have. Now, what was really cool about that experience, in her words, was that whatever these things were, who cares about dreams? I'll take you where I want you. And you're going to get there when I want you to be there. And here you are. Boom. Here we go. I thought that was incredible.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? It gives us hope in the sense that, hey, there are players out there that are unmatched in their abilities.
Yes, absolutely. And so I have a crazy wrap on my card that's all the symbols of the show. So there's like a UFO, there's tentacles, there's a pentagram, there's all this stuff. So sometimes people will approach me and I'm not always ready to engage in a wild conversation. I don't know what I'm getting into sometimes, but this happened just the other day. I was pumping gas and this guy comes up to me and he starts asking me about the symbols. And you can just tell when someone's like, I'm asking you because I want to be able to tell you about a strange experience. And just by the nature of you having these symbols on your car, seems like you're open to it. Well, he tells me that he used to run a restaurant in Jacksonville, and one night he got robbed, and he had a shootout with the robbers, and he got hit a couple times, and he then lifts up his shirt and shows me a scar, neck to nuts. And he says that he was in a coma basically for well over 6 months, 8 months or something like that. But the entire time his body was in the coma in the hospital room, he was on a craft flying around with entities. And he'd see them like eating something, and he'd be like, why? He's like, give me some. And they're like, you can't have any. You're not actually here right now. And then this is like, I'm pumping gas. I'm like, all right, man, good to meet you. I'm out of here. But I was just thinking about his story. It is quite strange. And it speaks to that weird liminal space between life and death and dreams, and
right,
what he thought was his intact consciousness for many months out here traveling with other beings. And it's like, what is that?
Is it?
It was a near-death experience. Was it simulated? Like, were the robbers possessed? Was this a orchestrated event instead of something random to actually get inside someone or extract their consciousness for 6 months? It's hard to say, but I like when stories don't exactly fit a conventional mold. And that was one where it involves near death, a coma, an out-of-body experience, and a craft. I was like, all right, man, you got me. That one might make it to air.
It did. Congrats for that guy. Yeah, that's an incredible take. I was invited to speak on a panel with a couple of MUFON ufologists. One of them was a state director, and he was giving us case studies, and he mentioned a case study that was very much like the one you just talked about. Now, the problem with much of what we're talking about is, again, we have experiences that they don't know whether or not they're in their body. I've read accounts where after the entire encounter is summed up and done, then they become physical again. I thought I was physical.
Yeah.
Right? So what we're realizing is that, in a sense, the body is the scaffolding to the soul, because we're seeing without eyes, we're hearing without ears, we're touching without hands, we're speaking without a mouth. There's something occurring on a dimension within us that we're ignorant of, that they are completely learned about. I mean, again, their access to us when they want us to inspire bilocation, to where you're witnessed in two places at once, and it's not the God helmet. That individual, like with Betty Luca, Bob Luca woke up one night and watched her leave her body. Think about that. Now, I remember early on in the show talking about some witch era case studies where men would wake up in the middle of the night thinking that's my wife next to me. It's not. Or because they lacked context, maybe it was their wife. Maybe it was the consciousness that they took from her, which would explain why she had the memories, just didn't have her body with her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was going to be one of my questions, is to what degree do you think they're able to co-opt a human body and navigate reality within it without other people really realizing?
Malachi Martin hypothesized the perfect possession. And perfect possession includes an entity that's not a walk-in. It's not Ruth Montgomery's theory of a walk-in, where it's not just, okay, it looks through the eyes, takes a look around, and then goes, somewhere else, does something else. A perfect possession is literally where the entity will hold its own body. In the pathology of possession, it's glaringly obvious. And in the book, The Red Fez, Fritz Kramer talks about going to Ghana or Haiti and dealing with a priest who would become perfectly possessed by an ancestor. And this priest, while he's possessed, he would take rocks and knives and begin to cut himself.
Mm.
And so Kramer asked him, what is the purpose of the cutting? What is the purpose of the scarification? Well, the entity is trying to mold that body in its image.
Mm.
Now we're getting to the root of the matter.
Yeah, the soul-skin connection that you mentioned earlier.
Absolutely. Yes, sir. And even more so that we're dealing with them wanting an image of the invisible.
Mm-hmm.
Right. To make something or someone in their own image, which gets back to the case studies in the Apocrypha of John, where they manifested and then manifested. Does that make sense? They manifested, oh, I'm the husband. Not really. I want to have a social skin in which to place my consciousness. And now I have the material image of the seemingly invisible. So we're witnessing this in real time. But I'll shut up, and I don't want to ramble.
It's all good. We were talking a little bit about publishers not being willing to go up to 11 and things you might not be able to say in certain venues and forums. And that always kind of annoys me because I've been doing this show for 13 years. And before that, I was just a fan of this kind of content. And I think the audience can take it. I really think that a lot of people who've looked at this stuff for a long time are ready to go up to 11. So it's frustrating to have publishers or producers play the role of gatekeeper and let's keep the kid gloves on because I don't know if we should really go that far. How are we going to solve the mystery, if it even is solvable, without all the cards on the table?
Right.
I guess I would just ask you, what might be some of those things that you feel like are typically not allowed to be talked about? Because a book like Nick Redfern's Final Events, it does get out there. There might have been resistance to it. He might have resistance the second time around, which he'll have to self-publish. But what do you think are some of those things that the system, maybe in entertainment or something larger, is really just trying to tamper down? Like, you can play in this pool, but we don't want to go over to this pool.
Well, I think that there's a multiplicity of reasons they're doing this. Number one, and this is by my own personal experience, there is a movement that wants to doctor data. And I hate to say it like that, but it's just true, in the sense that the publishers will only promote good accounts or positive accounts, and they'll kind of poo-poo that, and I don't believe that at all. I've even had a researcher that was big time. She is big time. She told me she was on a panel with a ufologist, and somebody asked a question about a negative experience they had. The ufologist got mad, pouted, and he's big time. I'll tell you after the show. Big time, pounded his fist on the desk and said, "We're tired of this threat narrative. We don't want to hear it anymore." Now, that is, again, because there is a movement to doctor some of the data to fit a predetermined narrative. Second of all, I do believe that these people have contracts. I mean, I can't say some things on shows because it's just, they can't do it. But I do believe also there's a measure of control by the phenomenon itself, where it does not want these secrets to be out. Now, my position is there are 3 levels to knowledge: the known, the unknown, and the unknowable. If it can be known, it must be known. It has to be known. It may people feel uncomfortable. It may cause them just bad feeling. I don't really care. Honestly, we have to get to the raw data. And in order to do that, we have to be honest with it. And even more so, what I realized doing these lectures and these shows is that the more room you give these experiencers to embrace what they've experienced, even by suggesting, hey, listen, they're not alone. There are various case studies that back up what you encountered. The more willing they are to come to the surface and say, hey, listen, I'm going to validate that research. They're not making this up. This is true. This is occurring. And because a lot of this research isn't getting out, there's a multitude of people who have stories to tell, just no one to write them or no one to propagate them in a certain way.
Yeah, it's a frustrating thing. And that was an interesting anecdote you told about the UFO panel, and it's a shame that Dr. Stephen Greer reacted that way.
Well, it's in him, but I wouldn't be surprised if he did.
Exactly. That's his shtick. And it's starting to feel like ufologists are just demonologists that haven't been read in on their true profession yet. Or of course, demonology might have been an older box. I think the further we go back, the more accurate the boxes are, but that might have just been like a box for a more religious era.
Right.
But I do think it's probably more accurate than ufologist.
I think it is too. I mean, my God, we're still changing terms. UAPs or UFOs. What are we dealing with, and why are we changing them? But yeah, I mean, we're getting down to the earliest case studies, the earliest manifestation of the phenomena. What you're dealing with here are people who literally have no working vocabulary, no real hypothesis. They know they experience something. They don't really know what that something is. And so in their feeble attempt to internalize the experience, they placed a face on the phenomenon. They applied agency to it.
Mm-hmm.
This is a horns and hooves. It's a demon. Well, what did it do? I don't care what it called itself, right? Oh, yeah, sure I'm an angel, sure I'm in all this stuff. And I think you're right. The more organic we get throughout history, the deeper we'll know about the phenomenon itself.
It's true. And in terms of who knows what, something I definitely wanted to ask you about was what the church knows. I think the Vatican would have to have plenty of information and understanding about this. You mentioned Diana Walsh-Polsulka. She's a previous guest of mine. Obviously, a lot of her research is from access in the archives that other people just don't have.
Was it?
So clearly there's something there. Maybe it hasn't been dusted off in a long time, but I think the inner circle of the Vatican has got to have a better handle on this than even, say, the military-industrial complex.
Yes. The military-industrial complex is what they've always wanted to do, even with Parsons. The Parsons technique to change or manipulate our consciousness to gain access to them in hopes that they won't destroy us. And, dealing with the Vatican and their archives, I was talking to one of my heroes in the field. And he said, he's from the UK. And he said, I've been to the Vatican. I've spoken to their researchers. And this is what I was told, that these are demons, that this is WFM, weird effing magic, and that there is a spiritual connotation to it, not just nuts and bolts. But even more than that, he was told that the war in heaven is still waging, in that we are in the middle of a battle between gods.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I would think that to be true, as opposed to the alternative, which is what the church usually tells people, which is the war in heaven has been won. Don't you worry about it.
Right.
Take your cracker and say your hymns, and we're all going to the promised land, baby. I would be more inclined to think that this is an eternal thing. This is a plane in which that chess match is played out forever.
I agree, my friend. I agree. I think that, and this gets into parapsychology even. Parapsychology, again, the scientific approach is germane, not just to the conversation, but to the field of research. But just because science can tell us the dimensions of the chessboard doesn't mean it can determine the laws and rules of the game.
Well said.
And so both of us have to be at the table, or we're going to be on the menu. That's just how it is.
Yes. And I know we don't have too much time left here. Something else I've heard you talk about in terms of going all the way back and really thinking about for how long people have been wrestling with this sort of stuff. Talk to us about the origin of the name or term Lilith, because it seems to relate in a lot of ways.
Absolutely. So obviously in Jewish mythology, Lilith was the first wife to Adam, and that she spawned a species of demons in the world. But as with most things, if not all things in the Bible, it's good to have an extra biblical understanding as well, because a lot of these legends, they were fermented in the soil of the Mediterranean. And so with Lilith, in order to understand who and where Lilith came from, you have to understand what a Lil was, L-I-L. A Lil spirit was a Phoenician entity that literally it was disincarnate, disembodied consciousness, where Lil itself was a ghost. And so the idea was that when you apply like a pecan lila or Lilit or Lilith, when you apply another phrase to Lil, what you're trying to do is articulate the origin of this entity and the species of this entity. So a Lil was a species of spirit. Not all of them are made of the same status, but the idea was that they are made of the same substance. And so at first, because of Lilith's victimology, which she was a lot like Lamashtu, she would go take babies from mothers. Steal them. You're gone. And early researchers and experiencers believed that this was not only because she had lived a life, she was disincarnate and disembodied, but it was because that those who knew her knew that she was unable to have children in life. And so in the afterlife now, she was fulfilling that role as a mother by taking babies from women. But that's I wouldn't even say liturgical, but that's where that term came from, was they were trying to describe the afterlife, which I think is fascinating.
Yeah, I've never heard that broken down in such a way, and I thought it was worth fitting in here because it's kind of a unique aspect to your repertoire. And so, as we're trying to bring this together, do you think that there is a way to stop them? Are there any mechanisms that seem to give people a little bit more control or autonomy in these experiences? Can these beings, even by their nature, be captured or eliminated? These sorts of things.
Well, the question hinges on whether or not they've designed the rat or if they've designed a maze. Are we using keys that they gave us, right? Forgetting the fact that they also built the door we're trying to unlock. How much access to us do they have without our knowledge? Are they the ones creating the incantations we're uttering? Are they stepping into the words we're speaking? Martin Buber was a great religious scholar. He said that God speaks a word and steps into it. Are these beings literally giving us incantations to conjure, in the fact that we are also being conjured? But to answer your question, instead of going off on that tangent I just hit, I don't know. Again, we don't yet have enough data to determine if these rules even apply to them. This is why I think that CE5 is just another attempt to classify spirits. What does this like? What does this one prefer? Well, this one likes it this way. This is how I talk to it. And in a sense, we're still leaning on rules that we believe they're following. And then we get into some murky waters. All exorcisms aren't successful. There are many of them that are unsuccessful. And in doing so, this is fascinating to me. Malachi Martin, Gabriel Amorth can attest to this as well, that when the exorcism fails, there is a self-correcting mechanism within the phenomenon. Now you have our attention. In a lot of these priests who fail the exorcism end up dead. And it's not unlike a lot of the whistleblowers or experiencers who were threatened. If you do not stop talking, we will implement something to control your tongue, even if we have to stop it permanently. So this is a fear that I live with constantly, this existential anxiety I have, because I have had people email me telling me that their guides are going to be waiting for me when I die. I have received phone calls in the middle of the night, even with an unlisted number. Hey, Nathaniel, I want you to know, bop, 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 bop. So, it's kind of like I'm trying to be ahead of the curve, but I don't want them to notice me. Does that make sense? I kind of like life.
Right. And there certainly is a trickster element to the way they behave. It's kind of like when you're playing with a child, like a 3-year-old, you pretend that their punches hurt and you pretend to chase them and then they chase you. And you're playing this game because you know that they have no ability to do anything to you and that you are really in complete control. You don't have a nefarious intent, so it doesn't matter, but you're just playing the game to let them feel good about themselves and feel like they're on equal footing. Something like that could be going on with these rules where you chant Jesus' name and say, oh no, I guess I better go. And it really means nothing. Or maybe it's an archetype that is built up over many, many years to have some kind of innate power to it. And it does have an effect. It's really difficult to know. But you mentioned exorcists, and I just wanted to ask you, how many working exorcists do you think are in the world these
I don't know.
days? I mean, I guess we'd have to fold in shamans and all sorts of things.
Right.
But
Yeah, if we're looking into religiously, I really couldn't number them. I know the Vatican has a lot, but their numbers are collapsing from what I've heard. So I take that with a grain of salt. I have a friend at Buffalo that it's actually San Francisco that told me that he's a priest. But I couldn't tell you. I do know that the exorcistic rite, again, just because the rate of success is high doesn't mean we know the reason for it.
True.
Right? Yeah, it's working, but why? We don't, again, we're groping in the darkness here. That would be my answer. I really couldn't answer that question. I know very few, and I'm just going to say it, in the field. There's like outside of Catholicism, or there's very few in the field that I respect, that I really hold in high regard. I've only known like 3 or 4 of them, and I love them to death. So it's not against the others. It's just I don't really know them. And yeah, I'm not going to go any further than that.
Fair. Yeah, it just made me think, if this is such a huge high stakes issue, you think there'd be more over time, not less. But if we fold in shamans and we fold in the whole realm of psychedelics and people going off to do ayahuasca, I mean, the shaman has been elevated. It's just not necessarily the Catholic exorcist that is in favor these days. Even some psychologists and parapsychologists, as we talked about, they're very adjacent to some kind of spiritual guru or hand holder to help people through these experiences. So yeah, definitions get tricky when we don't even know exactly what we're dealing with. And it's the same terms issue that we've had since the beginning of this conversation. So
indeed, my friend.
As we start wrapping up, I just wanted to ask you more about the irons you have in the fire. Your bio mentioned being the founder of preternatural epiphenomenal philosophy. I mean, how is that defined? Are there groups? Can people join? What's the deal there?
Man, that's an old bio. No, I'll tell you what. Early on in my research and kept coming against an intellectual wall. I struggled with it for years. And the idea, it was rooted in being in a pool of water and someone enters the pool on the other side, goes down the steps, and you feel the weight of the water. So a lot of people in the paranormal community, they'll measure the weight, thinking that I'm measuring the person in the water. And so, again, that's what's called epiphenomenon, where it's a secondary consequence. It's something that happens after something happens. And it's not just that we're studying it, but we're using improper definitions. Well, that's a demon, of course. It's the weight. It's not the demon, right? And in many cases, the phenomenon will use that secondary presence as a mask. That way you won't truly be monitoring and documenting and researching the entity that is in the pool. And so in many ways, we've gotten excited about it, right? Oh, I felt this, or I saw an apparition or something. But do we really know if that's the entity? Or is it something that it's projecting in front of itself to capture our imagination? First of all, does that make sense?
It makes sense.
Okay, let me move deeper. Here's why. Because I've worked with people in ontology where the apparition's here, but the orb is ahead of it, or it's behind it. And so the apparition is not really the entity. It's a projection of the entity. And so we're sitting there capturing a projection, or like I said, the wake in the water, the ripples that it's creating around it. And then we're documenting that, giving a face to that phenomenon. And then we've created an entire movement, right? It's a field of research for 100 next, no, it's really just a byproduct of whatever's there. And we've seen that even with Origen, one of the church fathers, he was asked why it is that when demons manifest, there is a cold front. And his theory was it's because that they're taking energy out of the air in order to manifest. But what we've been doing is monitoring and documenting the cold front, not realizing that there's an entire entity over there.
Yeah, a big cold front could require a big entity. Yeah, that's interesting. It even makes me think about Bigfoot. When I talk to people about that, they will bring up the fact that, well, a lot of times Bigfoot is spotted next to an orb. And it's like, well, maybe the orb is the technology that creates the projection.
Absolutely.
If you look into a projector's lens, it looks a lot like a glowing orb. I mean, I don't know what technology they're using, but we do often, I think, get caught up on the facades, the presentations. We never do see the projectionist or the director behind the scenes. I think that's absolutely true. And without a real concept of the environment, without a full mapping of all the layers, what is the dream world exactly? What is the spirit world? How many dimensions are there? Without knowing all that and knowing exactly what consciousness is, we'll never unravel it exactly, but that means we'll both be employed for a long time.
Heck yeah. I love it.
In terms of people being inspired to dig deeper or follow your work more closely, you've got one book out, another in pre-order status.
Right.
I think your website is down. Well, talk to us about, if they want to follow up with you, what should they do? Where should they go?
Well, I'm on social media. My website hasn't been active in years. I got tired of it. I'm all over social media. I was lecturing, researching, so it's not active. But I will give you guys some book references here. First of all, Spirit Possession in Judaism, Cases in Context from the Middle Ages to the Present. Ooh, yeah, I got that one. Obviously, Eros and Evil, Ariel Masters. Another one called Between Two Worlds by C.H. or J.H. Chavez, I think his name is. I probably murdered that last name, so forgive me. But this is about spirit possession in Judaism. This is what will connect us to the missing fetus syndrome. In modernity, it proves a lot of things, unfortunately. But to follow me, you can follow my YouTube page. I put out videos about my current research. I'm all over social media. I'm not on Twitter. I hate Twitter. But yeah, you can find me on Facebook. I've dated myself at this point. Facebook and Instagram, but that's how you guys can connect.
Right on. Very cool. Well, I do enjoy trying to unpack these things. I've seen behind the veil enough to know that there are non-human intelligences, as brief as those peaks were. So when you comb over encounters and you start to find a through line that goes through our sci-fi era, back through the religious era, and all the way, and the same sort of thing starts to be happening, well, you can start to piece together an agenda and try to figure out what this thing is. And I think that you are closer than most. So
wow,
I appreciate your time.
Greg,
Yeah,
come on, bro. I gave him $20 for him to say that. I'm just kidding.
If we're comparing to ufologists like Dr. Stephen Greer, then I gotta obviously say that you're further down the chain than that.
Oh,
and that's where a lot of people are these days.
Dude, I appreciate it, man. I'm such a fan. So, and it comes from my heart, dude. I just pour myself into the research. Not to say that everything I believe is right. I'm not saying that at all. I'm sure there are some loose ends that I could tie up, but it's all about the data. The dogma has killed us. Mm-hmm. The data is what's going to save us.
Cheers to that. Yes, we all have hands on the elephant, but I think your hands are on the more important pieces that maybe help us get a little bit further into what the mystery is. So thanks for breaking it all down for us.
Thank you for having me on, Greg. It's been a pleasure, man.
Likewise. Take care. Praise be to He, Nathaniel Gillis, holding our hand on a nice walk through the darkness. I liked it a lot, and this was a hard one to name. So many provocative terms I could have used. Demonic agenda, cracking the life code, demonic consciousness colonization, technological necromancy, demon-alien interface, demonic hybrids, co-opting consciousness, hijacking human creation, and demonic self-replication. I'm sure I missed a couple, but those are the things I jotted down as we were cruising along. So as far as terms go, A+. But I do, in all seriousness, think this is a more accurate paradigm for the Greys rather than planet hoppers. I know there's an element of us looking back to a more religious age and a tendency to frame things up in that religious context, but I think there's a lot of residue and aspects of that you could cut off and just look at this pretty secularly and get even closer to an accurate paradigm. And, the alien thing is so hot right now, and just my opinion here doesn't mean that we still don't have plenty of guests who consider these things aliens. And I still keep an open mind, but I just like to use the wrap-ups to say when I think someone is hovering a little more over the target for me personally. But who knows? I don't have experiences with the Greys, so this is all guesswork. And if you disagree with me on my conclusions, it doesn't really matter too much, as long as I still cover the spread, and you can just stop listening before my bullshit ending. I will say it was also nice that we synchronistically ended up with a new cover for the theme song to start the day with. I was actually trying to find something else entirely in my inbox, and just by putting in the search terms, I stumbled across this email from 2018 where someone decided they wanted to cover the song, and I said, what the hell? And I listened to it and I liked it, and I don't think I'd heard it before. And in the email, they asked to remain anonymous. So there's that, but not bad. I also thought it fit the vibe for this kind of episode. So I'll put it in rotation.